Now by microwave, Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa speaks with Charles Templeton in Toronto.
We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
Under the great hammer blows of homogenizing from the United States.
But all it took to enter the United States was a New York marketing expert and a campaign to make moosehead an exotic specialty.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Red Ensign, a podcast about Canada, a people, not Canada, a post-national state. And here with me today, I have an illustrious guest, Will Tanner, and he's here to talk about the Anglosphere. I have a number of subscribers, one in particular who's written several books about this topic, who's been after me to talk about Canada's place in the Anglosphere and the extent to which the Anglosphere is a real thing or a kind of a fake thing. And so I thought I would get somebody who loves writing about it on here, a very famous Substack personality. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thanks so much for having me on. Excited to talk to you about this. It should be a fun time.
So you've written extensively about what I would call the cultural legacy of the Anglosphere. Do you want to kind of, when we speak about the Anglosphere, what we're speaking about, at least what I speak about when I'm speaking about the Anglosphere, is the legacy of the Anglo-Saxon peoples scattered throughout the world as a consequence of the British Empire and their life in the countries that they found themselves, right? So I think still today, probably a majority of Anglo-Saxons live outside the United Kingdom. And many of them in America, many of them in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also many of them in countries that are not, that have post-colonial governments that are not, don't share a sort of political legacy of the empire in quite the same way. Is that a fair assessment of what we're speaking about here?
Yeah, I think for one point of clarity, really, though we're talking about the Anglo-Saxon people, it's the the legacy of the impetus to do great things that the Normans gave the Anglos. It's a point Thomas Carlyle makes in the first volume of his History of Frederick the Great, that before the Normans showed up, the Angles and Saxons really enjoyed drinking and not doing much of lasting legacy. And then with the 1,000 or so families that settled, they got a little bit of a backbone or more of an impetus to go out and do great things from there. And so really that's like where I started culturally, and it's the culture that flowered from that and went on to do great things from there, much more than like the Tolkien-esque Angles and Saxons before the Normans, even though really that was a much purer Anglo-Saxon culture, which is a minor point. But just in terms of like what we're talking about, it's really from 1066 on.
Yeah, I mean, the Anglo-Saxons have an incredibly deep history. But, you know, whether you pick up at 1066 or pick up at 700 really is not that important in terms of what the Anglosphere looks like today.
Right.
We're shaped by that long legacy, and most of us outside the United Kingdom are shaped by that legacy as it existed during the flower of the British Empire, both in sort of the first iteration, the Elizabethan Empire, and then later the kind of 19th century empire. That's how we got where we are, scattered around the earth, excluding a tiny population in France. And so when you write about these people, you write about, so when I was thinking about what defines that culture which is scattered around the world, there's obviously a genetic set of ties that exist. but there's a common history, a common culture that, at least to some extent, still exists. That culture lives on in common religious forms. It lives on in common forms, in common political forms. It lives on in dress, music, art, theater, athletics and leisure, all kinds of things. What do you think are the most important elements of that culture, the ones which cannot be dispensed with in order for it to retain its fundamental character?
The first and most important, I think, would be ordered liberty as a concept and commitment, in terms of there are various liberties to which most citizens in the Anglosphere, at least traditionally, kind of in the period of empire you're describing and forward, we had access to those liberties. They were extended to us. And that, however, is distinct from licentiousness, and distinct from kind of anarchy or social chaos. So I think that general framework for what government should do in terms of protecting that cherished ordered liberty, rather than infringing upon it or letting people do whatever they want, is an important distinction from a lot of close but different cousins of ours, particularly the Germans, the French. So I think that's one thing. I think the second is the Anglosphere has a unique relationship with urban life, where we're both at once, interested in it and not hostile to the concept, but at the same time, really the Anglo dream has been to have a place in the country, whether it's a manor home in Britain or a farm, a hobby farm, a gentleman's farm in America, or I think the concept is similar in Canada and Australia. There's this concept of using the city rather than the metropole being really the main thing that matters, which is somewhat different from, say, the Low Country.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touch on two quite deep items, right? So when you say there's this tradition of order liberty, that's a political concept, but it's not a political form, right? So, and it is a concept which is at times instantiated into law and at times just kind of a dream, right?
Right.
The concept of ordered liberty, in terms of freedom, had a legacy in the Anglosphere even during the peak of lockdown, because of the way the people who were the descendants of that tradition responded to it, even if it wasn't in a live political concept during that period. Similarly, you kind of have this tension in the United States with the kind of more libertarian elements of American culture and the Anglo tradition of ordered liberty that doesn't see license, particularly license with regard to things like prostitution and recreational drugs, as legitimate elements of liberty.
Right.
And then you made another kind of interesting point about the relationship that so what I'm trying to get at here is that the relationship, whether it's the relationship between the Anglo-Saxon person, particularly the aristocrat, and the city, and the relationship with the concept of ordered liberty, these are traditions that are carried. What's the substrate along which they're carried? I suppose they're carried along with art and literature and maybe our religious concepts. How do you think these are transmitted? Because certainly the idea of the manor home and the sort of rural aristocrat as the kind of ultimate aspirational dream, they're deep and constant in Anglo-Saxon culture wherever we've gone. They have been for at least 200 years, maybe more than that. And yet I'm not sure how that dream is transmitted exactly.
I think the big thing is that a lot of the various things that the English-speaking peoples enjoy doing, whether it's hunting, fishing, really even organized sport, those stadiums now make this somewhat easier. It requires access to space, really a great deal of space that's not overly expensive to live it out. Like you can't do a bird shoot in
Yeah.
Atlanta, even if you somehow got permission from the government to shoot the pigeons. It just wouldn't, work. So I think there's that. I think also the different forms that we like don't exist well in the city. Like neoclassical architecture is popular in America for government buildings, or at least was until the very recent present, and it looks nice enough. But really, like the attachment, the deep attachment and beauty, I think the Anglo soul feels is to the Palladian or Baroque or Jacobean country house architecture,
Yeah.
much more than the city house. And similarly, the countryside permits the flowering of ordered liberty somewhat more so than the city with its teeming hordes. If you read F. Scott Fitzgerald's work about the period really right before and right after World War I, there's this hostility that the primarily WASP main characters in his books have with the immigrants who are there. And it's the need to deal with those immigrants that requires much harsher government policies regarding alcohol or regarding prostitution or regarding license generally. So I think
it's interesting because even in places like if you read the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as like a primary source on attitudes in the late British Empire, in a place where there are no immigrants, right, or no substantial number of immigrants, the way that there are in like F. Scott Fitzgerald is talking a lot about the conflict between the WASPs and the continental immigrants that arrived during the 19th century wave. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle isn't talking about that at all. And yet, if you look at his work, certainly there's a sense in which the country aristocrat is a pure, more English thing than the urban aristocrat in London. And in many cases, the caricatures of the urban aristocrat in London are actually quite negative. This is true of, Conan Doyle is the most famous of the authors of the period, but almost all 19th century British authors have this. They attach the kind of negative stereotype of a slumlord to the aristocrat in London because of the poor condition in which the underclass is kept. Whereas the assumption is that in the countryside, the underclass is kept well, and that's fundamentally more virtuous in some way.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, you have the tendency in the Anglo world for the middle class to want to become aristocrats rather than be hostile to them. This is the point that I mainly got from Beckett in his the English Landed Elite 1660 to 1914. But there are other books about it where the English middle class and really the Anglosphere's middle class would much rather be J.P. Morgan or Lord Grosvenor rather than just destroy that and have it reapportioned like happened with the Jacobins and the French middle class rising. It's just a different attitude towards social preeminence and hereditary wealth that allows, I think, a more stable formation of things. And perhaps that's because of our tradition of primogeniture and the idea that things should be passed on whole. Perhaps it's something else, but I think it has very much molded our culture where even if there is this underclass resentment against those above, though I think that was more muted in the country scene you're describing. Of course, not so much in the urban scene. It was something where the middle classes and the upper classes were not at each other's throats in the way that they were in most of the continent in the same period.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently read Bernard Cornwell's his Sharp series, which is an American take on Napoleonic combat. And you only have to read like 20 pages of it to see that it's like a 20th century American take on this period, rather than if you've read any of the literature from the period in question, because it's just riddled with this kind of class, this sort of class resentment narrative kind of strung through it. Whereas if you actually read people writing from a British perspective from the 19th century. That's very much not. I mean, class is always a kind of understated element of the work, and class resentment is always downplayed in anything that they write, whether it's personal or whether it's like published work, which is just, it's a very different way of looking at the world. I also think it's something that partly distinguishes America from the rest of the Anglosphere. I mean, there's this is interesting because you are an American, and yet most of the Anglosphere would debate whether America properly belongs in the Anglosphere, and they would debate it partly because of this class element, also because of the I mean, obviously the United States has lots of other ethnic groups in it, but the other real element is that most of the rest of the Anglosphere shares a political tradition, and the United States does not. And I find that quite interesting. What do you think about America's unique place in the Anglosphere?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a question whether certain regions of parts of America should be included in the Anglosphere. Like, really, I don't think the Midwest should, because it's just like a wholly alien entity to what a lot of the traditions in the Anglosphere are, since it was primarily settled by German farmers. Whereas, the South, or New York until recently, were much more clearly in the Anglo tradition. Culturally, religiously, they acted more like Anglo-Saxons in the New World than something else. So I think there are parts of America that are much more closely aligned with the tradition we're describing. I think
the other thing that I think is interesting here is that parts of America are divided along class lines as to whether they're Anglo in culture or not.
Yes.
Right. Basically, the entire northeast, as defined, sort of New York, New Jersey, and northeast of there. Anglo-Saxon culture is defined as that which is high class,
right?
Which is a really strange dynamic when you look at it from the rest of the Anglosphere, where Anglo culture goes up and down the class spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's really across America. Like in the South, there's still some places in Virginia that do fox hunting and have country manor homes. It's probably the largest concentration of wealth in America. Similarly, Thomasville, Georgia, is known for its bird hunting. Very Anglo atmosphere there, whereas that's not really the case in Atlanta anymore. Or Charleston is kind of known as a high class city and has that Anglo vibe. I do think there's a political difference in America beyond just us having Congress rather than a parliament, and that because of the American Revolution, we never really had a Tory tradition in the same way that others did. Like, where even our semi-aristocratic slave owners, like John Randolph, were Democrats rather than high Tories, which is somewhat odd, and the ideology doesn't really map onto the personalities or their views of life. I guess there's the somewhat carve out of the Federalists, though they, of course, wouldn't call themselves Tories. So America does struggle, I think, very much more with the hierarchy question than other parts of the Anglosphere, at least did traditionally. Britain probably does more now, particularly after World War II, with the labor regime and the changes it wrought, where there's a lot more unnecessary class conflict there now, and that hierarchy has been torn down to a much greater extent. So it's hard to say if these things hold still, or have held for the past 60 or 70 years, but at least traditionally, America did have this greater spiritual attachment to at least nominal egalitarianism in a way that was not the case on the otherwise right-leaning parts of the Anglosphere.
Well, it's interesting because when you visit the Anglosphere or study its history, places like Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, the struggle with egalitarianism and hierarchy feels like an American import to our culture. And it's weird to say an import from a part, like from another part of the Anglosphere, you know. And so I have this sense that the United States is both part of and not part of the Anglosphere at the same time. And it's hard to, given its position at the center of the American Empire, its racial politics, its ongoing ethnic transformation, I suppose that's probably always going to be the case from this point forward. And yet, I don't think you can dispense with it as a part of the Anglosphere, especially as like a deep contributor to its 19th century history.
Well, and one other point on that is that a lot of authors have made this point. Tuckman makes it probably most clearly in her The Proud Tower. The American upper classes, for one, as you mentioned, are much more Anglo-minded than most of our compatriots in America, but it also have largely avoided political leadership or duty and responsibility regarding the political scene. So even where those who would be the American socio-political elite could be pushing this more Anglo tradition and culture forward through the nation, they largely haven't, and have just left it be to the varying vying ethnic groups in America and their democratic political bents, which has changed. It not only changed America a lot, but certainly changed what we inflicted on the rest of the world a lot, and probably for the worse. So I think
I want to ask you about that, because you're a person who studied the history of the Anglo-Saxon families in America more than anybody else that I know. Why is there this almost allergy to political power among them, particularly in kind of beginning in the late 19th century?
Yeah, so I would say first, this was not really the case in the South, at least the Cavalier South.
Yeah, that's right.
There was more of a tradition of political control, but then all the sons who would have inherited that tradition were either killed or dispossessed by the war between the states, and it really just died from there. Some of them held on to it, like the Wade Hampton family, who Hampton was actually a senator after the war, but by and large, they were just wiped out where that tradition died. I think the other thing is that in, say, New York, where this really could have blossomed, where there are these old families, they did have wealth for a long period of time. A lot of it wasn't tied up in land that was peopled by tenants. It was, with the exception of the half dozen or so manorial estates, it was really tied up in financial instruments relating to New York City, even if the holders of them lived on country manor homes outside the city. Right. And I think that more plutocratic form of wealth just lets one not have to deal with the political side of things better, at least in the short term, where in Britain or Rhodesia, you get these large landowners that, because they're always dealing with people and their land cannot be moved, they either have to hold it or not. They do have just more of this connection with the people on it, and more of an understanding that they have these political duties that are attached to it if they want to keep it. And that tends to have some influence on transmitted understanding of political duty as related to wealth and class. Whereas in America, like if you own shares in a bank that's investing the proceeds on your behalf in Chicago real estate or forests in the Great North, I don't know, it's just a kind of different thing, and they didn't have to worry about it. And so they didn't worry about it. And then it went from them just not really thinking about it that much, but joining the army when they needed to during the Civil War, not joining the army, just paying a substitute. And then from there in the 90s to just being checked out completely and kind of hoping the problem went away. Or like the Astors just fleeing the country completely because they hated the political scene so much, which is probably a mistake from a tax perspective, but regardless, it's what they did. So to answer your question, I know I rambled. I think in the part of the country where it would have existed for longer, because the primary form of wealth was the land, they were just killed or dispossessed, so it stopped existing largely. And then in the parts of the North where it really could have existed and continued existing, the form of wealth that became dominant just wasn't really conducive to ensuring continual respect for political duties, and so they just fell away because people would prefer not to deal with it. They prefer to be like Jack Morgan and playing around on their yacht for their whole life than.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you really notice if you study the lives of WASP aristocrats in what's now called the burned over district. There's this relationship with leisure in the late 19th, early 20th century, which is, I don't know exactly what to say about it, but it's very strange. Right at the very moment where these people are being dispossessed by mass migration, there's they kind of, rather than engage in politics to try to address the problem, they just kind of check out, and they check out not just from political life but also from religious life. So like if you look at 1830 to 1910 in the burned over district, you have this really, really deep tradition of an Anglo-Saxon Christian religious life. And between sort of 1890 and 1930, that religious life is really profoundly changed, and it goes into what becomes an almost terminal decline. I wish I had a better explanation for it. In the UK and in Canada, the association between the church and the monarchy and what happened in World War I were profoundly influential in the decline of the Anglican and mainline churches, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church as it's called in Canada. But that phenomena, like World War I, was not traumatic in the United States in the same way, nor was the church tied up with the king in quite the same way. Do you have any explanation for how this changed, or is this as much a mystery to you as it is to me?
To some extent, it's a mystery. My only point would be, I think what happened politically, particularly in the North, what we were just talking about with the form of wealth not being really conducive to understanding of political duty, I suspect that a lot of the same thing happened religiously, where if you look at, say, the first Duke of Westminster, he largely lived on his estate in Chester, though he traveled some, and there's always the exception of the London season. But while on his estate, it was understood that amongst a patrician's duties was going to church, sitting in the front pew, letting the locals see you go to church. And they were people who you knew, where it's really hard to get out of that duty because people would see you do it. And in his case, the church was literally right next to his house, where, they just had to do it. Whereas and that was a pretty, across socioeconomic class thing, where it was the middle classes in the village, the laborers around the estate, the small farmers, all of that kind of going to church and seeing them there. And it was a patrician duty. By contrast, if you're, say, a Brahmin in Boston, or one of the old Knickerbocker or WASP elites in New York City, and you're anglicized, but you're all living together in whatever very small section of New York City in your townhomes, and you all go to church together at the same place where people below you in class don't go. I think it's a lot easier to skip out on that than it is to skip out on the situation described in Chester, just because people of your own class don't really care. It's not a duty or a patrician one. They might ask where you were, but I don't really get the sense that they cared in the same way that people should care about a duty. And so once you stop going to church, most people know this, like once you stop going, you just stop going for good, at least for a while. The habit dies. And
and more importantly, it fails to be transmitted generationally, right?
Exactly.
The first generation might be a Christmas and Easter churchgoer, but Christmas and Easter church going doesn't transmit generationally at all.
Right. So I suspect that's what happened, but I would be hard pressed to come up with any conclusive evidence of that. It's just kind of what I suspect was going on there.
It's quite interesting. So there are a whole number of other sections of Anglo culture that you touch in extensively on your Substack. Everything from aesthetics and dress to aesthetics and education to kind of art and theater as kind of deep elements of Anglo culture. One of the things that I'm interested in looking across the Anglosphere is this kind of in and out of time sense of Anglo culture. So the United Kingdom is in a kind of a bad way right at the moment, and culturally has been in a bad way for quite some time. Though I think it had more role to play in sort of modern music than is initially apparent until you kind of look more deeply. This has resulted in this sense where WASP cultural signaling is like this time capsule of the late empire. So when you ask someone what a British person looks like, the image they come up with is an image which is accurate at the very latest, kind of circa 1950. This seems to be tied up with the failure of the Commonwealth in creating a common and living culture. What do you think about that? And do you have a sense as to why the Commonwealth failed to create a living culture, and what its prospects might be in the future?
Yeah, I think on one hand, the reason why you get this attachment to older forms is that the new ones really just don't compare aesthetically. We've been degrading rather than advancing aesthetically, at least since the period you described. And so, if you're thinking about something that you find honorable or worthy of respect, at least for me, I'd much prefer to jump to the image of it that's in morning dress than in like a hoodie, sweatpants. It's more appealing on every level. And also, I think that aesthetic better represents what the idea of it represents. So if the English Empire is this powerful, mighty entity, whether it's Flashman and his scarlet jacket or cherry picker pants, or it's, the frock-coated aristocrat, it's just a better representation of what it represents. I think the other thing, like what you're talking about with the Commonwealth not holding together culturally or developing culturally, is, in some respects it did. I always talk about Rhodesia, but so I won't bore your listeners with like a long dissertation on it. But Rhodesia really did actually develop after World War II.
This is actually a really important point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but unlike Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Anglo-South Africa, the culture of Rhodesia continues to develop as a distinctly Anglo-Saxon culture in the period after the war, even after its independence. And you can see the aesthetics and art of Rhodesia continues to evolve as a living culture right up until they get conquered. Whereas in Canada, Anglo aesthetics stagnate completely after the Pearson gives away the relationship, moves Canada from the British sphere of influence into the American sphere of influence. I'm curious, do you think that political independence is an essential component of life for the Anglo-Saxon culture? And that's the reason why it continued in Rhodesia in a way it did not continue in some of these other jurisdictions?
Probably not. I think if you look at Rhodesia from, say, 1950 to 1964, admittedly, it was growing more independent by the end, and there's the Federation, but it wasn't independent yet. And it was, I think, developing culturally and in a living way over that period, much as it still did during independence.
If I might interject here, what I mean by political independence is political independence. So Rhodesia between 1950 and 1964 is a vassal state of the United Kingdom, not a vassal state of the American Empire.
Yes.
Right. And because its political tie is still back to England, rather, at no point was Rhodesia ever an American vassal, right?
Yes.
Whereas Australia, New Zealand, Canada all go through this process of moving into American vassalization in the post-war period.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious whether you think that process is what caused the termination of Anglo-cultural development in those nations, or whether you think, and because Rhodesia never went through that process, they kind of are this unique window into the continued life of that culture. I'm curious what you think about that thesis.
Yeah, I think, on one hand, America was interesting in that it was one of the few places that, because of just its supreme status at the time, did develop a little bit after the war, where the space age and atomic aesthetic died, which was terrible. And from there, we just degraded as much as everyone else. But for like a flicker of 10-ish years, that aesthetic was cool and it was alive. And it was a development of the Anglo soul in a very interesting way, where it was this idea of going on to do great things and building just these, going to Herculean lengths to build these very impressive things, which, it's a different form of like the manor house or country home spirit, but I think it's related, and it's this desire to show glory through some monumental accomplishment. And so we did develop a little bit, and then that just died. And if you look at why it died, it was America finally just got shot in its final living sectors by the egalitarian pill, and we just died from there. And so I think once you start looking at the Anglosphere over this period, so say in 1965, really there's not like that much of a reason for America, Canada, and Britain to exist as separate political entities as you're describing. It's just this like amorphous gray blob of strip malls is to what it's developed, where there's not really much of a point in life other than like a vague sense of the economy line going up, and there's not much that's unique about it. Everyone wears the same first gray suit and then gray tracksuit and then gray sweatpants if they wear a shirt at all, where it's just depressing and drab, and the point of life is economic consumption. That I think that is a culture killer, where just nothing develops from there, and it's depressing. Rhodesia was different in that it didn't get hit by that. If you like, maybe it was because it still kind of had a frontier. Maybe it's just because of who ended up in Rhodesia, but you still had this culture of excellence in Rhodesia, whether it's the Ridgeback being bred to like play nice around kids and be able to kill lions, or it's the Rhodesian farmers running these tens of thousands of acres cattle estates, while also being able to be soldiers, or it's, Ian Smith being the model British gentleman as he declares independence from Britain, someone in the tradition of George Washington. There was this culture of excellence that I think really, like, it's that culture, going back to the Carlyle thing I mentioned earlier, it's that like idea of needing to accomplish and do something before, reclining and drinking, that really helps the Anglo soul flourish and helps Anglo culture flourish. And Rhodesia just had it in 1965, despite being under attack, in a way that at that point, the rest of the Anglosphere really didn't. It was just strip mollified. So, what conditions led to that is a bunch of things. I'd be hard pressed to name them all.
Well, it's very hard to kind of disentangle it. I mean, in Canada, I point to the moment where, prior to the war, if you went, there was one style in which Shakespeare was performed. And after 1965, you had a bifurcation where there's this tremendous fanaticism to do Shakespeare as it would have originally been performed, bifurcated from this hyper modern, like feminist reinterpretation of Shakespeare. Today, if you, I went to try to take my my children to a Shakespeare festival at a place in Ontario. They founded a Stratford with a like model Globe Theatre back when Canada was much more English than it is today. And they have a Shakespeare festival there every summer. And so I thought, okay, well, they have Henry V on, maybe I'll take Romeo and Juliet. So maybe I'll take them. And it's, Black Romeo meets like, it's out of the tradition of intentionally subverting everything that is British about Shakespeare, contrasted with the like perfect historicist constructions you see. And when those two things have pulled apart, I think what you're seeing, at least in Canada, is this bifurcation where elite culture wants to follow the status lines that lead into New York, and which are kind of hyper egalitarian, and want to deconstruct the British identity of the place. And then you have this maybe bourgeoisie rebellion against that to try to keep to the tradition, but a culture can't live without its head, right? It cannot live without an elite committed to its preservation. And so you end up with this kind of zombie culture where everybody's trying to reenact the forms of the Anglosphere as it once existed, but without a kind of real political life to it.
That's an excellent point. It's you get these things where people try and hold on to the prior forms that existed when things were good, and I'm guilty of this. I love wearing tweed and that sort of thing, but it doesn't work. You can hold on to the traditions a little bit, but if you're the one guy in morning dress at Buffalo Wild Wings, that's not going to work for you. Much as just trying to do the same Shakespeare thing over and over and over again isn't going to work for you, because people get bored, it dies. Like you said, nothing can survive, I think, in stasis. And to get this continual flourishing of Anglo culture in its various forms, dependent on the region and people there, I think you need this ability to strive towards and exemplify excellence. And that if that is crushed for whatever reason, I think typically now it's this just egalitarian thing. It's really hard for things to go from there, because there was a point to the London season. As our friend Johan Kurtz has written about, there was a point to that, and it existed the way it did for a reason, and it developed from there, and it was interesting. If you go to a debutante ball today, which they still exist and they're still quite nice, the point of them isn't the same anymore. People there already have dates. They're not like debutantes, actually. It's just people kind of like the form, so it survived for one more generation, but it'll probably be mostly dead in the next generation, because there's no reason for it to exist anymore. It's not
or
really
if it exists, it will exist as a museum piece, right?
Yes.
And one of the things about our particular culture right in this moment is we're just riddled with museum pieces. People are obsessed with preserving forms that they view as superior to modern culture, but without those forms being genuinely alive.
Right. Well, an example of that, Scott Besson, our Treasury Secretary, is a homosexual who lives with another man and I believe an adopted daughter in his house on Rainbow Row in Charleston, which, if you know anything about Rainbow Row, even like replacing the leaded windows is this Herculean task of dealing with all these planning boards so that the form of this house remains exactly the same as it was in 1850 or whatever. But if it's a gay man living there with his partner, it's just been entirely obliterated, other than in like the pretty color of the house and the somewhat more pleasing architectural form of it compared to what exists now. The whole spirit that represented is entirely dead, and the form is, I guess, a museum piece, but a dying one, because the culture it represents is just entirely dead within it. It's the same reason the National Trust House in England, even if you go to them, it's not really the same thing as seeing one that's lived in. It's just, it's kind of slowly dying, a devastatingly sad death.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the questions that one of my subscribers put to me is, is it possible to revive the religious and cultural life of the Anglosphere? And I think he meant Anglosphere X of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about this now for months, because I don't think that you could ever have living elite culture in a place like the Anglosphere as long as all the political lines lead out of the country, right? Because all of the best and the brightest and all of the achievement is somewhere else. So how can you have Anglo culture without
Right.
because the people who most exemplify that culture are going to leave by the nature of the thing that they aspire to. They're going to want to become attached to this kind of world bestriding colossus of an empire that represents values which are antithetical to the values which drove this man to join it. It's a very strange historical moment that we find ourselves in, but it's completely frozen the cultural and religious life of the Anglosphere. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I think the point you made about the political form is a good one, and I would go a step further in that the like the political situation is just so toxic that the elements of traditional Anglo culture, hierarchy, order to liberty, long-term planning, long-term horizons, none of that can exist in the current state. And that's both because of and independent of America. Like Britain, ever since the 50s, has been terrible with the American influence. But even before then, Clement Attlee wasn't, he might have been an American lackey once he was in power, but his political thought didn't really come out of America, yet it destroyed Britain all the same. I was talking to a Viscount who now lives outside the country because the state seized most of his family's assets in the 50s. And at the point where the people who would be leading the culture have just had everything expropriated from them through decades of 90%, the 60 to 90% death and income taxes, that really just eradicates everything that would be the basis of a renewal and puts it in the hands of people who shouldn't have it. And it's been toxic, and you need to get over that. Not just the taxes, but the whole political scene that's attendant to it and that allowed it to happen, for the traditional Anglosphere to flourish as it would have flourished, which, that's another thing Rhodesia represents, is if you look at who settled it, a lot of the people who were prominent in Rhodesia were aristocrats or landed gentry that got tired of the British system. It's focus on socialism, its extortionate taxation, the just terrible political scene with the rise of labor and socialism. And so they left for Rhodesia and set up shop there and created a flourishing of Anglosphere culture in a way that wouldn't have existed without that happening. And as America's power diminishes, if indeed it is diminishing, which is, we'll see, that's the sort of thing I think you could get again, and is the way that Anglo culture could flourish, even if it's not flourishing in the Anglosphere itself. Like, were Eric Prince to take over the Congo again with 1,000 trusty Americans, perhaps you'd get something interesting out of that. I don't think that will happen at all. It's
interesting that you mentioned this, because when we opened this, we noted that a substantial portion of the Anglosphere actually exists in countries that are not politically, that have a post-colonial political situation which is not dominated by Anglosphere politics.
Mm-hmm.
The new Zimbabwe still has little fossils of Rhodesia inside it. The new South Africa still has little fossils of Anglo-South Africa in it, and this is true all over the former British Empire. In some ways, I wonder if those little fossils can be a little bit more alive. I mean, Canada is a good example of a country that it is structured explicitly to suffocate whatever remains of Anglo culture here. I don't know. It's an interesting. It's beyond my ability to prophesy, I suppose.
Right.
As we kind of bring this to a close, what does it mean in this moment to love this tradition, to be part of it, to want to bring it forward into the future? How does someone live as part of the Anglo-Saxon tradition in the Anglosphere without participating in either its deconstruction or without just playing pretend at a culture that's kind of that's a museum piece rather than something that's alive?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because really most things do fall in the two camps. I would say one is it really helps to read period literature and try and draw a few ideas about why they did things more or less the way they did from them. Like the works of Jane Austen are kind of fun to read and great for that, where there's this it's this intentional focus on cultivating higher civilization. Like all the people in those books could have been dominated by their base instincts if they wanted to be. Some of them were, and set up as the bad guys for that reason. But the good characters didn't. Like Mr. Darcy is described as not only being, once he has his scales falling off his eyes moment with Elizabeth, is like a charitable gentleman and kind of condescending in the old sense of the term. But he's also described by the caretaker of his house as being a good landlord where all the tenants love him and respect him, and goes to church. He does all the things that they wanted people in that period to do to cultivate something higher. So that's one example of kind of what it meant in its heyday. And so if you look at that now, there are still ways you can do that. Like, you're not going to dress in the same way. If you wear like a top hat and opera cloak to go out to the theater, you're going to be laughed at, and you probably should be. But you can still try and cultivate yourself. Like, don't have dirty fingernails. Make sure your shirts don't have some coffee stain on them. Make an effort to wear a jacket and a button-down shirt and tuck it in instead of just doing the sweatpants routine. You be polite and charitable to those in your daily life instead of rude and snippy or just the like autistic staring at the screen thing. Those are all minor things by and large, but I think combined they represent, and much more besides. Those are just a few like immediate things that come to mind. Combined, the focus on cultivation, I think, represents thinking about a higher plane of things, and that's really like that was an integral component of the flourishing of Anglo culture. Similarly, if you look at a lot of these people, whether they were lords or wanted to be lords, they were adventurous and did exciting things. Like, that's part of what's fun about reading the collected works of Lord Ernest Hamilton, really his 3 books about his personal life. Is in one chapter he'll be at a shooting party at some country estate, and then in like the next he'll be tromping across Alaska for months on end, both looking for game to hunt and for investment opportunities for the Duke of Abercorn's fortune. They were doing things. The same is true of Bender Westminster, is one of the more prominent ones. Oswald Mosley famously preferred dueling to golf. I think that is a particularly important part of it, because right now the people who do want to focus on this, even if they focus on the cultivation part, really are museum pieces in a lot of ways. Like if you go to the Daughters of the American Revolution or Daughters of the Confederacy, it's just a museum. And if there's anyone there who's young, it's someone who's like way too into Civil War buttons or whatever. That's not what this is meant to be about. I think you really should try and like do exciting things, like go outside, do something, try and be exciting and the sort of person that people want to talk to and get something out of talking to, and then want to emulate, because I think that's the only way we'll get this to continue flourishing. And if you look at the last place where this did flourish, Rhodesia, that is what they represented. On one hand, they were known as being more British than the British, and they were at least the ones who represented the Rhodesians were always very proper in how they dressed, proper in how they spoke. They did the things like have the clubs, have the drinks, have the hunting. But at the same time, they also were very adventurous people, very exciting people. They went out and did things that went against the grain and required excellence and fortitude. So to wrap all that up, I think look at areas in your life where you can be like that, where you either can dress a little bit better, be a little bit more cultivated, be a little bit more polite, or can be more adventurous, be more exciting, preferably all of that combined. Because I think really that's the only way we'll start getting back to a place where this is flourishing again. My final thought would be that it requires bravery, because doing any of this requires going against the grain pretty much entirely. You have to be the guy who's better dressed than everyone else in class in sweatpants. Don't do it to a ridiculous extent, but you need to do that. You need to do these things. And that continual standing up to the cultural zeitgeist, the horrific egalitarian moment in which we now live, I think really will require fortitude moving forward in the small little ways that end up mattering in the end, not in some big Ragnarok style showdown with like the lesbian commissars. As fun as that would be.
It's interesting because my thoughts are, I don't disagree with the importance of cultivating personal virtue and looking back at the history of our people to understand what virtue looked like. Right, the example of dressing better and taking care of yourself physically is a good one. It's been a value that our people have shared for a very, very long time, and shared as a sign of kind of aristocratic intent. The kind of idea of noblesse oblige is a similar foundational principle. On the other hand, I sort of wonder if, like, one of the things that I think very few people want to look at about sort of late 19th, early 20th century Anglosphere culture is the collapse in birth rates and the collapse in belief. And in some ways, I wonder if a restoration of the Anglo culture requires an encounter with what I might call the rougher parts of life, an encounter with religion in a more primal form, a return to a life which is not sterile. In some ways, the aristocratic families of 19th century England were too pretty and clean to have children, right? They refused to have contact with them quite notably, and sent them to boys' schools in which homosexual abuse ran rampant. In some ways, I think an essential part of cultural recovery for the Anglosphere begins with re-encountering the frontier, re-encountering the hard edges of life, and responding to them. You talked about Anglo-Saxon culture as forming in great degree in the encounter between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, way back in British history, where the Normans brought a kind of continental sense of the higher things to a people that had very rough sensibilities, and were very grounded and in connection with the edge between life and death. It's one of the things why it's one of the reasons why I think the decline of hunting as a pastime is such a tragedy for Anglo culture, because it's one of these ways in which the Anglo-Saxon man was able to continue to connect with his primal self.
Yes. And
I really think the crisis of Anglo-Saxon culture in the 19th century is a crisis of over-socialization and over-civility. And I think recovery passes through like a hard encounter with God and a hard encounter with the physical edges of life and death, in a way that is difficult to do in a way that requires you to break out of the kind of hug box that is the modern world.
Yeah. Could I add one thing on that point since you brought it up? I don't want to hold notes, but the like hunting is a great example of this. The reason that the nobility engaged in so much fox hunting, which was just ubiquitous across this period of glory, it wasn't just that it was fun, though it was, or a status symbol, though it was. It was that fox hunting, because at the end of it, the dogs tear the fox apart in front of you. The point of fox hunting, is traditionally done, was that it got your blood up and exposed you to the bloody side of life, particularly for the male aristocrats who were taught that not only did they need to, hold the fork correctly, but they also needed to be able to go put down the Sepoy Mutiny or whatever it was that they were up to in the reaches of empire. Like they had to be able to do both. And fox hunting was a way where, you're wearing the pink coat, you're wearing the top hat, you're riding the well-manicured horse, but at the same time you're leading the dogs to go rip some animal to death at your feet. It requires being able to do both, as you were saying, to like get your blood up and expose yourself to the nitty-gritty of life. However, I think the carve out there is that it's done in a way that is sustainable, at least before animal cruelty laws, because it's an enjoyable practice. People wanted to keep doing it, and you're able to pass that folk way on. Whereas, like, one of my continual complaints is the like vaguely Puritan drift of things on some of the Christian right, because I think the Cavalier form of life is much more sustainable in that you do want to pass it on. Like these traditions are not only important and building of culture, but they're also enjoyable, so you want to pass them on. I think when things are not sterile, which is bad for its own reasons, but like require affecting a commitment to something or keeping yourself in a state of frenzy and passion that's unnatural, as has happened with some personal acquaintances of mine who have or whatever, not to get too personal on it, but that is unnatural. And because it's unnatural, it will die as soon as you no longer have the energy to keep it up. And then you lose all the benefits of it immediately. Whereas if it's a relatively low energy, or a thing that can be perpetuated without having to put in so much energy, where it's not a fusion reactor, where it's, like nearly impossible to put in enough energy right now to keep it going, but rather one that just, perpetuates itself. I think that is much better. So I think we should look for the traditions or ways to adapt the traditions that can do what you're saying in terms of bringing us back to God, bringing us back to religious passion, bringing us back to blood and soil and life, rather than just this sterile, like weird, like brutalist concrete where it's clean and ugly at the same time. We don't want that, but we also want it to be able to continue existing and to not require these like affected impulses.
Clean and ugly at the same time is a fantastic way of describing the kind of death throes of Anglo culture, where it's clean and refined, but it lacks a vitality. It lacks you repeatedly quote the bar bill for the party celebrating the end of the end of the American Civil War on the American side, the American War of Independence on the American side. I'm not a huge. I think drinking is maybe overdone in Anglo culture a little bit, but there's a vitality and just like a will to power, a will to life in the Anglo culture of that time that I think as people think about revivification of this tradition, they fail to grab onto that, right? It's easy enough to go and, buy a nicer suit and make sure you're properly shaved or whatever. It's a whole other thing to seize hold of the desperate struggle for the life and vitality of your people that once defined them. Yeah. And I think that it's much harder to put a concrete face on how you do that, but I think that's an essential step in the project of trying to get Anglo culture through this very difficult moment.
Yeah, this is a point. I was just reading a book called Aristocrats by a guy named Robert Lacey. That's interesting, but one point he makes in it is that particularly the British landed elite seemed to think it would be unsporting to fight the socialists and democracy too hard. And so, in Gone with the Wind, she writes about the aristocrat who would lose his plantation while playing a game of whist and just calmly fold the cards on the table because he lost. And to some extent, like, a sense of fair play and going along with it is a good thing that keeps civilization bound together. But you can't go quietly into that good night. That was the signal failing of the traditional elite in the 20th century, was that it didn't fight harder against the democratic impulses that it knew to be wrong, knew to be evil, and instead just folded its cards on the table because it didn't want to be unsporting.
That's right. I consider it like a deep tragedy that Canada died as an Anglo-Saxon nation without even one of us dying in combat against that. Right. I mean, my forefathers fought in, a dozen wars on behalf of the British Empire, but never won for our own survival as a people. And I think this is an error which will have to be corrected in generations to come. It's difficult to kind of see exactly how we get there, but get there we must. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me. If people want to check out your work, what's the best way to do it?
Easiest place to find me is on Twitter. If you look up Will Tanner, I should pop up. If not, it's at Will_Tanner_1. If you prefer long form thoughts, then definitely my Substack. It's the American Tribune.news. And I mainly write about stuff like this on there.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. And I will be back again soon. This is my inaugural experiment with my new setup. So hopefully we're lag free and I have guests again for the foreseeable future.
Thanks for having me on.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.